Now, if everybody's sitting comfortably, then we'll begin. Thank you all very much for coming, and a very warm welcome to this month's Grantown Society meeting. We managed to run one every month throughout the winter, and somehow we managed to run different ones every year, and I don't know how we do it, because we've now been running for almost 50 years. In fact, one of the things that we're very much thinking of and hoping we can all get all our heads together is what we do in 2024 for our 50th anniversary. So there's something to ponder. However, tonight we're not going back that far, but well, it's there. It's all. I don't need to say anything else, really. Basically, it's welcome. It's glad to see people with drinks, because it does put something back into the bar that helps to justify our existence here. And I want to welcome Steve Goodall, who's been doing all sorts of research into this, and this is the sort of second of 3 talks, and we'll talk about the next talk later on. Do remind me.
I'll do my best.
But we're going back with the Home Guard. Not those particular guys, let me say. They are not going to make an appearance personally, but there they are. And I'll leave all the explanations to Steve. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
I feel I should be saying Fescana, good evening, but anyway. If you haven't come across me before, I'm a member of the Society and the Museum and the Clan Grant Association, so I've got a foot in all sorts of camps. My background is in education. I'm trained as a historical ecologist and with a parallel career with the services. If you don't know about historical ecology, we were born as a discipline in the late 70s and were described by classically trained historians as mongrel nosy parkers who didn't know their place in the world, because none of the disciplines that we didn't follow one particular discipline, we followed all sorts of things. But anyway, that's beside the point. So what we'll do is we'll get going. Who do you think you are kidding, Mr. Hitler, if you think we're on the run? We are the boys who will stop your little game. We are the boys who will make you think again. 'Cause who do you think you are kidding, Mr. Hitler, if you think our England's done? Mr. Brown goes off to town on the A21, but he comes home each evening and he's ready with his gun. So watch out, Mr. Hitler, you have met your matching us. If you think you can crush us, we're afraid you've missed the bus. I'm going to be looking at a number of sources, and these 3 books and pamphlet here, publication, well, it's not a publication, are the main ones. But I also want to draw your attention to these folk down here who've been of huge amount of help. In particular, can I just mention the National Library of Scotland librarians, who seem to have maintained their research and copying service throughout the pandemic, unlike a certain other archive centre in Edinburgh that struggled somewhat. But anyway. Were the Home Guard really as old and decrepit as they're made out to be in the well-known TV series? Were they really the amateur bumbling idiots who came good at the last minute? I hope to prove that's entirely a wrong picture. And it's come about because if there's anything good come out of COVID at all, it is that the archive centres have digitised a huge amount of stuff, which has made it available online. saving you expensive visits down to the capital. Also, the 70-year rule ran out in 2015-2016, and a lot of records which had, for some obscure reason or other, been sealed are now available. There are a number of myths about the Home Guard which we're going to look at through the course of what I'm going to say. But I'll just mention two for now, or three anyway. The first is that in the event of invasion, the church bells would be rung. That actually was an edict sent out from London that was only supposed to apply to the south coast of England. It was never ever applied anywhere else across the country, but kind of leaked and became what was expected. And you probably know in the film there's a well-known incident where that actually happened by mistake. The other myth that's persisted is that all the signposts and place name signs were all taken down. Well, yes, they were. Again, in the south of England, where a 20-mile deep stretch along the coast had 80% of its civilian population evacuated, which actually casts some doubt on Warmington-on-Sea and the population as it's shown on the television, because those folks simply wouldn't have been there. But anyway, as it turns out, the signposts and place names were all very hurriedly put back, because the army in particular discovered that its convoy drivers and dispatch drivers couldn't read a map and steer at the same time. Anyway, there we are. I'm going to fill in some background now about against which the formation of the LDV, the Local Defence Volunteers, and the Home Guard was formed. By 1921, German agents were already active in the USA, France, and Britain in particular, on the instructions of the German High Command, stealing military and other secrets, industrial secrets where they could, and stirring up trouble amongst the communist factions within those countries in a determined effort to cause trouble. The counter-espionage effort was led by a man called Desmond Morton, who was head of the Department of Economic Warfare. And he was actually so effective that in 1939, when war was declared, every single Abwehr agent at large in the country was arrested and interned. And many of them were turned into double agents. Meanwhile, generals such as Guderian, who were very interested in the future of modern warfare, were very busy buying up OS maps across the entire country, sending them back to Germany where they were republished in German. We actually have one of the German maps in the museum. It was actually picked up out of a wreck of a Luftwaffe aircraft in Norway. So they weren't playing about. They knew exactly what they were doing. Guderian also managed to get hold of a book by a man called JFC Fuller. I don't know if any of you are military historians at all, but Fuller was the man who invented modern tank tactics. So Blitzkrieg was pinched, basically, off from Fuller, and nobody seemed to be that bothered about the freedom of where this stuff was going. In 1939, the Military Training Act, because it was clear that there was trouble brewing, required all men aged 20 to 21 to register and attend 6 months training, military training. And my father was one of them. The other comment to make is that when the expeditionary force went to France in 1939, it was highly equipped, but largely with obsolete and obsolescent kit. They left all the modern stuff, the best stuff, still in store back in Britain. And that had a profound impact on what happened subsequently. National Service Act of September 39, all 18 to 41-year-olds not in restricted professions were called up in age batches. And that meant that by June 1941, as the next age group, the 40-year-old group, was called up, they'd already served for 2 years with the Home Guard, and it made a huge difference to the quality of recruit that was being taken into the army. There's an interesting wee little story about Strathspey at the outbreak of the war that I'll throw in here for good measure. There was a rumour that German planes were going to use the red-painted corrugated roofs as navigation beacons and markers. And every hardware shop in the valley, in the Strath, was raided for green paint, grey-green paint. And actually, the guy who's got a sleeper cottage at the back of where Heather and I live still has a green roof, although he's just repainted half of it ochre red. But it's just one of those daft things that happen. So as the prospect of war grew and the outbreak took place, there were a large number of unofficial armed groups were formed by various folk throughout the country because they felt that the British government wasn't doing sufficient to deal with home defences. And this began to cause widespread alarm amongst both the police force and the Ministry of Defence, the Ministry of War. And coupled with that, of course, were a lot of the broadcast rumours, as you'll hear in a minute, and newspaper columnists who were claiming that there would be nuns or parachutists dressed as nuns drop by parachute. Oh, an incredible sight that would have been, wouldn't it? Behind the lines, to cause chaos. Parachutists had been used to invade the Low Countries. Can I just point out that German parachutists, when they landed, were dropped unarmed. They had to go and find their weapons from the containers that had been dropped somewhere near where they were. And it nearly caused absolute catastrophe for the Wehrmacht when they invaded Crete. But anyway, very well. The Germans actually knew what was going on in this country just before the outbreak of the war. And I'm going to quote from a Berlin newspaper. This is the report. It was repeated in the Times, bless it. The British are evolving a type of warfare in which weapons will be carried openly in civilian hands, and in which individual men and women will, that's interesting, isn't it, will threaten the lives of German soldiers from ambush with every conceivable kind of treachery. So, propaganda. One of the people who formed an unofficial armed group was Tom Windringham, who had been the commander of the British battalion during the Spanish Civil War. And as a very left-wing gentleman, his political views were considered highly suspect, and his activities caused, again, considerable alarm. He actually ran an unofficial training school at Osterley Park. It was promoted by the Picture Post, and he wrote a military training booklet called The Armies of Freedom and New Ways of War that saw widespread circulation. I don't know if it's still available, it might be. So the outcome was that the War Office, bless it, were totally opposed to the formation of a home defence organisation. There was absolutely no way they wanted this armed group swanning about the countryside with no communications and no real means of central control. Neither did they want, should those groups be formed, neither did they want a repeat of the experience in World War I, when soldiers on leave took their Lee Enfields home with them. And if you've watched Peaky Blinders, you'll know where a lot of those weapons ended up. And the only sort of official experience that the British government had about such Home Guard organisations was the Austrian Academic Legion, with obvious Nazi affiliations. And one member of that group was a guy called Otto Skorzeny, who was responsible for the setting up of German commandos and the freeing of Mussolini later on. So they weren't too keen.
I want to speak to you tonight about the form of warfare which the Germans have been employed so extensively against Holland and Belgium, namely the dropping of troops by parachute behind the main defensive line. Since the war began, the government have received countless inquiries from all over the kingdom, from men of all ages who are for one reason or another not at present engaged in military service, and who wish to do something for the defense of their country. Well, now is your opportunity. We want large numbers of such men in Great Britain who are British subjects between the ages of 17 and 65. 17 and 65. To come forward now and offer their service in order to make assurance doubly sure. The name of the new force, which is now to be raised, will be the Local Defence Volunteer.
Okay. And that was on the 14th of May 1940. And 4 minutes later, or so, the first recruit walked into a police station to be met by the desk sergeant who hadn't the foggiest idea what he was talking about. So the LDV was actually set up in 3 days, from conception to implementation. In Scotland, which was officer commanding Scotland area, he was a general staff officer with the rank of major, and his second in command would be a captain. There would be an area headquarters manned by unpaid area organisers and group organisers, and then they allocated zones for the LDV, which more or less corresponded with the old historic counties. That's how it all worked. And that would have implications for Granton as opposed to the rest of Strathspey. We will see that later. It was the Army Council and the County Lords Lieutenants who appointed the area organisers, the zone organisers and the group organisers. So at that level it was very much a question of the old boys network. So they only wanted folk who were reliable and suitable and from the right sorts of families. And it's a criticism of the LDV and a bit about the Home Guard in the top echelons that it's never really quite shed. And I think that's actually unfair the way things came out. And each zone was then divided into subgroups. So that's how they kind of did it, top down. By May the 16th, the General Staff Officer Northern Command Scotland was General Carrington, and his second in command was Lieutenant Colonel Wynne. And it was organised on pseudo-army lines, but with some interesting differences. Each company comprised 10 or often a lot more platoons, so it could be 400 men plus. A platoon varied, but usually comprised 8 or more sections. And each section was village or locality based of around about 100 men. So Granton would have been a section. So the LDV basic unit was the section of 10 men. And the sergeant who was appointed or chosen to lead that section was elected by his own men and usually served a probation period of about 6 months when he would be confirmed in that position. And that really stuck in the craw of the regular army, that the sergeants were being elected by the other ranks. They did not like it. They didn't, well, I was going to say they didn't like it up them, but there we are. So what we've got is number 3 group, number 1 zone, North Highland sub-area, which was the equivalent of a battalion of around about 1,000 men. So all these titles, you can see how the bureaucracy is kind of trying to pin down the organisation and get it into some kind of order as the War Office saw it. In Inverness, there was Colonel Sir Donald Cameron of Lochiel was the group organiser, and they had the Territorial Army Drill Hall at Margaret Street in Inverness. And the assistant organiser was a Brigadier, A.D. Macpherson. And originally there were 4 companies for Inverness. There was Badenoch and east of Loch Ness, Loch Harbour, Fort Augustus in Kinloch Leven was another group, Skye, and then the 4th one, Inverness. The notional strengths then came out as a section of 25, a platoon of 100, a company of 400, and a battalion of 1,600, but very often much bigger. And briefly to touch on weaponry, I'll say more about that later, but what was supposed to happen is that all private weapons were supposed to have been handed in to the police. But in rural areas such as Strathspey, that just didn't happen. So guys turned up with their deer-stalking rifles, shotguns, and anything else that they happened to have found. The first thing that happened was that any Lee Enfields were then impounded and taken away. And the whole of the LDV were issued with over 82,000 Canadian rifles, the Ross rifle, which proved to be highly unpopular for various reasons. The uniform was denim coveralls, which were absolutely hated by the guys, and then there was an LDV armband and forage cap, which was basically entirely inadequate. And we've got a rare survivor here of an LDV armband. You know, they're just not around. You go online and look for one of those. This actually came out of a book called Lagan Remembers, which was published a while back. And there is the Kinloch Lagan platoon, one of the few group photographs, and there's some names there as well. And I popped that in as a reminder to ourselves that Canadians were involved in all of this as well. When the LDV formed, it was the Newfoundland Forestry Corps that made a corps of Home Guard or LDV folk, because the Canadian Forestry Corps came later. And I didn't realise that Newfoundland was actually a protectorate until, had gone 1949. It wasn't actually considered to be part of Canada at all. And they didn't think themselves as being Canadian either. There's a story that when the CFC turned up, they were very surprised to say, "Oh, I thought you lot were already here." And there were Newfies that got camps all over the place. Hold on a minute. So, on the 17th of May 1940, the LDV was reorganised on army lines. The old insignia that they wore of a blue chevron or blue stripe, pale blue stripe, was replaced with regular army insignia, and the Ross rifles were all removed because they were heavy and they tended to jam, and they were replaced by about 1.5 million M1917 Springfield rifles. And when they turned up, the guys took, well, we're not using that American rubbish, until they found out that the M1917 was a Lee Enfield by any other name, in which case they quite liked it. But it did have 0.306 caliber ammunition, which was not the same as a standard Lee Enfield. That actually didn't cause problems in the logistics, because it meant that the guys in the stores just sent the Home Guard one lot and the regular army another lot, and hopefully didn't get them mixed up. So, other than the explanation you've had so far as to why I've done this work, part of it came off being given this photograph by Alison Grant in Boater Garden, and that's the Boater Garden platoon. And we've been fortunate in that we've identified the bulk of these folk, and I'm just going to pick one or two out. So back row, third along, Alexander, whoops, sorry, shouldn't have shown you that one. Let's go back. This chap here, Alexander Shaw, his son Eddie Shaw still lives in the village, so that's quite nice. Along there, further along, right at the end actually, there. If you've ever had your car serviced at a local garage, you might recognise it from the family. That's Thomas Clark, member of the well-known Clark family in the area. Let's just see. The middle row, we know who he is. This is somebody we don't know, but this chap here, that's Jock George, who had Curraw Cottage, related to John George, who was an engine driver on the GNS, and was Lorraine George's, Lorraine McPherson's grandfather. And next to him is Isabel Sinclair, who is Alison Grant's father. And he lived in a house that seemed to be very vulnerable to being run into by military traffic. I don't know quite why, but anyway. And then in the front row, 4 along, 1, 2, 3, 4, this chap is a J. McGillivray. I sense either James or John McGillivray, and he's an ancestor of John, the farmer at the farm that's there now. Yeah. And then 2 along, what is it? This, somebody there. That's Alan Grant, who's related to John Grant, who had a garage in the village. And he's quite an interesting man. John could not serve with the Home Guard. He'd actually had his garage appropriated by the army, and he was one of the few folk in the area who had the papers that allowed him to go up into Abernethy and Tulloch. And he kind of taxi drove all sorts of interesting people that I'll be touching on next week and subsequently. They say he was given a code name because of the work he did in conveying SOE folk around, and we don't know what it is, but I'd like to think that his code name may have been Barloon, the midwife, because he delivered people. But So right. So this picture's quite interesting, but before we do that, we'll mention Nethy Bridge Home Guard, because of course you'll have been spoken to about the Home Guard locally by Mr. McCook. What we now know is that they were commanded firstly by Captain Vince, who had the Grey House in the village there, and then by Lieutenant John Murray. Their sergeants were Lewis Grant and George Gordon. They had a Lance Corporal that we haven't identified, and of course Privates Alistair McCook and Private Davy Miller, but there must have been a lot more of them whose names we don't know. And that particular Home Guard did spend a lot of time patrolling what they call the Pass, which was the road up into towards Loch Garton. And if you go up to the Nature Centre now and look at just outside the gate, there's a platform there which is the remains of a guard's hut. That was manned by Royal Army Ordnance Corps folk who looked after the munitions dump in Abernethy Forest. So Granton Home Guard. Now, this picture comes from Society Records, Bill. It was one I found when I was doing some cataloguing for you. And there are two possibilities. I favour it being the Home Guard, because if you look at this chap's uniform here and compare it to this one, this guy is not up on a charge for forgetting to sew his buttons on. World War II blouses didn't have buttons. World War I uniforms did. And I suspect that is the Granton, a part of the Granton Home Guard platoon, because of that mixture of uniforms. The alternative, and that then produces more questions, is are they F Company 6th Seaforths? And if they are, it means that the Dunkirk story about the Seaforths has got to be looked at again, because there was a group called Ark Force who were detached from the main division that ended up in Dunkirk and surrounded at Saint-Valery-en-Caux. F Company appear, if that is F Company, and there is another photograph showing them retreating to Le Havre, and it's labelled as such, it means that F Company were not at Dunkirk. They got out through Le Havre, and that's why they're back here in 1940. And, you know, if that's the case, good luck to them. But I still think this is more likely to be the Home Guard. But it just shows you the sort of things that can crop up. Their commander was Captain Hendry, who lived in Shalimar, which I think is in,
Woodside Avenue.
Yeah. 68 men joined the Granton Home Guard, and they were known as Granton Independent 2nd Murrayshire Home Guard. So they weren't in Inverness-shire at all. They were entirely separate county and organisation, despite being within a few miles of each other. Duncan Grant, who's as you know, is at the museum, one of his uncles was one of the ones who patrolled, and a group from the Granton platoon was sent in 1941 with a regular unit down to the Isle of Wight for a brief period, because they'd had a heavy bombing raid and they needed some guys to help clear up. And there was also the thought that the Isle of Wight might be a bit vulnerable to invasion. So Granton platoon got about a bit. 1943, you've got various changes of people in command, and if you're interested, we've got lists of names. But what we don't have is a comprehensive list of who was in it. And this is something I want to come back to at the end. as you probably be aware, a lot of premises in Granton were requisitioned. The YMCA, the Coppice Hotel, the Garth was used for officers' quarters, as was Benmore and Rose Hall. Seafield Lodge was the officers' mess. Dunvegan had the MO's headquarters, medical officers' headquarters. Sergeant's mess was at Speyside House. Air Raid Patrol HQ was at the Mission Hall. Castle Grant ended up with Indian Transport Corps folk there and other things that we are still trying to get to the bottom of, because folk are being very tight-lipped about it. And I also found out that at Balmenic Distillery were parked up about 70 vehicles and a fuel depot belonging to a composite Royal Army Service and Transport Corps Group 154, and they left in 1944. So all these places needed people to guard them, and I think we'd say that Granton Platoon was very busy providing guard folk to keep an eye on them, despite the fact that a lot of them were regular army units there, but the Home Guard were used to kind of be the public face. Oh, there was a field ambulance post here as well, and we actually have a list of all their names. So this is how it was all organised. You can sort of have a look at that yourself. Quite extensive. So Boat of Garten is there, look, with Nethy Bridge. And Granton is down here in the Elgin, 1st Battalion Elgin and 2nd Battalion Forest. So despite being so close geographically, the units did not work together very much at all. So this is a map showing where the various units were based. So up at Inverness, you've got this group who were largely an anti-aircraft unit. They were Home Guard, but they were trained in anti-aircraft skills. Forres and Elgin, Granton is here. Foyers number 1 also had an anti-aircraft unit. Fort William headquarters, and so on. As you can see, quite an extensive deployment throughout the whole of the Strat. The insignia that the Home Guard wore. So if you were in Scotland, Home Guard and regular, you wore a shoulder patch like that. And then you've got the Cameron Highlanders and Seaforth Highlanders. Now, had a guy called Childers in 1890 not had a bit of a brain fit, Inverness and Granton would have stayed with the Seaforth Highlanders. But for whatever reason, the War Office in 1890 decided that was a bad idea, and Inverness was placed under the association with the Cameron Highlanders. So if you were in the Inverness Home Guard, you would wear the Cameron Highlanders cap badge, as well as the Home Guard shoulder flash. If you're in Granton, you wore the Seaforth's stag, and then if you were an auxiliary, you know about the auxiliary units, you had a badge like this. That one over there is quite an interesting insignia. It only ever appeared in around 1943, 1944. And outside Boat of Garten there was a dummy army camp. And some of the Home Guard there had to put that insignia on and parade about pretending to be members of the 58th Highland Division. The 58th Highland Division never ever existed, except in the minds of the Germans, who were intercepting dummy wireless signals to convince them that there was a large mountain trained force being put together in Strathspey and elsewhere that was going to go and invade Norway. Most of it was done by wireless from various signal stations around. But before that decision was taken, they did actually produce a unit insignia and get some folk to put it on and pretend. The fact that there were no German agents whatsoever to see it didn't seem to have occurred to anybody. So, going back to weaponry, so we've got a few illustrations here. You've got the Canadian Ross and then the M1917, and there's what I was telling you about. There's a myth that there was a shortage of weaponry, and it is a myth. I mean, we accept that, we've accepted that for years as being what the situation was. But a lot of folk have been analysing stocks in army depots and so on, and been looking at the state of equipment during and after Dunkirk. And the conclusions are quite interesting. The British Army lost 60% of its equipment when it evacuated from Dunkirk. Virtually all of it obsolescent kit that really wasn't really very good. The best stuff, 40% of it, was taken back and quickly resupplied from the depots back in Britain, where the most modern kit was actually being stored, but it just hadn't been distributed. The Germans, when they captured forces in and around Dunkirk, were quite surprised at how lavishly, but actually how badly, the expeditionary force was equipped. They got tons of stuff, but it wasn't actually much good. I think somebody, when it was captured, picked up the Lee Enfield rifle from the soldier and said, "What, are you still using this old rubbish?" What seems to be the case is that it was largely a logistics problem, that there was plenty of stuff, it was just in the wrong place. And if you put together an LDV in 3 days, and then you've got upwards of 500,000 guys who all want rifles, you've got to ship them somehow and get them out to people, and all the ammunition. But you can see what was going on. Before Dunkirk, we've got this lot. Nearly 250,000 rifles still in Britain that are ready for and could be redistributed once they've been sorted out. In June, you can see stuff arriving from the USA, and another 200,000 M1917 rifles came. 1 million Enfield rifles were in use with the regular army in Britain, in store and up for refurbishment. The myth seems to be have helped along its way by the order that Home Guard guys did not take their weapons home. They had to be stored in an armoury. Now, Granton's fortunate when it formed its Home Guard in that it had a local armoury. I haven't tracked down, for instance, where Boat or Lethe actually stored their weaponry. I can only assume it was in a town hall back room somewhere. So that's really why this whole kind of picture that the Home Guard didn't have any weapons comes about, because they weren't allowed to take them home, and they were only allowed to draw a rifle when they went on patrol. And of course, because the platoons were rotating patrol responsibilities around a number of men, if you got 50 men, you didn't need 50 rifles, you only needed 20. So no, there wasn't one rifle per man, because there was no need for there to be one rifle per man, and they weren't allowed to do that anyway. Second Murray, you've got some stuff here in stock, loads of ammunition. So you've got a strength of 68 there, look, and you've got 20,000, 21,000 rounds of ammunition. You've got tons of stuff. Now, originally, had there been any issues, 2 code words would have been sent to the Home Guard: hearth and home. Unfortunately, that began to cause some confusion because people couldn't tell the difference. And one was get ready to do something, and the other one was you better jolly well get out there because something's happening. So they were actually replaced with standard army issue of stand to and action stations. And at stand to, Home Guard were called out, equipped, and sent to their particular locations where they had to operate. And action stations, all leave was cancelled and the invasion was expected to be imminent. It didn't happen. They were also issued with a strange thing called, and I hope I've got this right, a Celanese triangle. Well, a Celanese triangle is basically lengths of yellow silk. And what you do is where you've got your post is set up, you lay out this triangle, asymmetric triangle of yellow silk, in the hope that the RAF will not come along and think you're going to shoot at you. But that's where it comes from. There were tensions between the regular officers, army officers in particular, and Home Guard folk on the ground, who couldn't understand some of the rather brainless and pointless orders and deployments that they were being asked to deal with. They knew that the roads were narrow. They knew that the roads were not suitable for convoys of army lorries. It wasn't going to happen. They knew that where deployments were taking place, they would happen on a train, by train. And so it was the Home Guard from the bottom up that began to agitate for a change in what it did and how it was deployed. There's also the situation that they were facing a diminishing number of recruits, volunteers, although in 1941, if you weren't in other occupation that was war related, you had to serve in the Home Guard regardless. But enthusiasm, as the prospect of invasion diminished, enthusiasm began to decline somewhat. And of course, as 17-year-olds became 18, they were conscripted. And the army was saying, thank you very much for those year or two's training, we'll take them off your hands now and put them through an accelerated basic training program, because we already know they're pretty good at what they're doing, because they could drill, they could shoot, and all the rest of it. Just to give you an idea, an army battalion on the move. Now, if you're into army vernacular and whatever, but a battalion is basically a regiment by any other name. A regular regiment could have anything up to 5, 6, 7 or 8 battalions in it. And historically they were allocated different roles, but anyway. So a battalion of around about 800, 900, 1,000 men, plus all its kit. And if you wanted to move it, you required a convoy of something like 50 lorries, 50 Bedford lorries, even if 50 Bedford lorries were available. And in convoy, on narrow roads, you could only drive at 20 to 25 miles an hour. You weren't allowed to go any faster. And each lorry had to be 50 metres from the one in front. So they would have taken up quite a lot of space. Yeah. So a convoy could have been somewhere in the region of 2,500 metres long, travelling by at fairly slow speed. Just to give you one example of the sort of thing that had to be done. In 1944, Montgomery's 3rd Infantry Division was up on the Firth of Forth at Culbern, doing D-Day invasion practice. D-Day invasion practice. And I've got a list there of what the 3rd Infantry Division consisted of. But you're looking at upwards of 30 battalions of infantry, armour, that's tanks, artillery, and support services. And to convey that lot up to the Firth of Forth by rail required something in the region of 90 separate trains. And then those trains had to be dispersed. And then when the training was over, those 90 trains had to come back again and pick them up. So it meant the railways were busy, and that's why the Home Guard became more and more closely involved at Granton Station, East and West, and Botham, Lethe, and all the rest of it. The only road route actually that was of any real significance was the B970 out of Botham Garden up to the crossroads. It's been realigned now, it's not how it is today. And that's how the munitions that were unloaded in Botham Garden Station, bombs and ammunition and possibly other stuff as well, was taken by converted tractors and trailers and stored up in the forest. And the traffic was sufficiently heavy that the bridge, the wooden trestle bridge, had to be strengthened by the Royal Engineers, who promptly managed to set fire to it. And the old ferry had to be reinstated to carry on the transfer. The munitions used to arrive in the dark on a Tuesday night to be unloaded by RAOC men in the dark. And then the empty train took Canadian cut timber back again on the Wednesday morning. So, quite interesting. And of course, Balmennet required fuel, so there would have been railway tanks of petrol, diesel, whatever, being taken. What's emerged is that but the Home Guard provided the outer public security guarding system for these places. And you'll know about the SOE up in Glenmore and so on. It's the Home Guard that kind of guarded the village end of the road. There's an archaeologist, Anne Wakeling, talking to her some years ago. She described Strathspey as resembling an armed camp, because Granton had at least 4 checkpoints for Home Guard roadblocks. Seafield Avenue, the road out of the town to Aviemore, and so on. Botham Garden similarly had one on the Deshar Junction, and another one on this road, the B970. These are quite interesting maps in themselves. I don't know if you can read it. Can you see this? See, it says here, Inter-Services Research Bureau. You see that? Well, that's what the SOE called itself when it was being public. Okay, so these GSGS maps from that we've wheedled out of the War Office show various locations. This is Station 26. This is where the Glider Club is now, but it was an SOE training area for Lysander aircraft that flew out from RAF Longman and did agent training work there. And it's an ex-RAF Longman guy who knew about that field and established the Glider Club in 1965. And actually until 1963, that landing strip was still being used by the Army Air Corps because they managed to crash one of their light aircraft when they were doing close liaison work with the TA in 1963. And it came down. There's supposed to be photographs of that, but I've never found them. And the Home Guard would have provided an outer perimeter of security to keep people away. What else have we got? Well, there, yeah, you've got the railhead depot is down there, and so on and so forth. I just thought I'd put those in out of interest, but they sort of show the extent of the SOE involvement here, with the Home Guard providing the outer perimeter of security. And if you managed to get through that, you would have been met by some fairly heavy-handed guys who wouldn't have welcomed you any further. Did local people know what was going on and what the Home Guard were having to look after? I would say yes, they jolly well did. The Leslie sisters had a tea room in Granton. I'm not entirely sure exactly where it was, Bill, but
I think it was probably somewhere down roundabout where the kilt shop is now.
Ah, right.
There are those
Yeah,
who will know much better than I
makes sense.
on that.
Yeah.
Down bottom end of the high street.
Aye, right, yeah, that would make sense. Yeah. I mean, they had Norwegian Ling guys come in there for tea and breakfast and all the time. And in an interview with a Norwegian paper, because we've now got access to some Norwegian records that we didn't have before, thanks to some work done down in Hertfordshire of all places. But anyway, they knew exactly who these guys were, and they said in the interview we knew who they were and we knew exactly what they were going to do, but we just kept quiet about it. And that's the advantage of the rural area, I think, in that any stranger would have stuck out like a sore thumb and immediately questioned as to why are you here. Although there are one or two interesting exceptions, which we'll come to. There's the guard hut remains outside of the nature centre, and there's an electricity supply to it as well. This is at Rothimercus. Can you imagine living in that thing in the winter? Again, Rothimercus had to be guarded by Home Guard folk so that folk didn't go wandering up what is now the mountain road. You can just about see this here. This is at Upper Croft Nagan, just up from the crossroads where you turn up into. Sorry? Yeah, he was a plumber, wasn't he? I believe at one time. Yeah. Yeah. So Royal Army Ordnance Corps guys lived in there. Best of luck. But again, the road up to there would have been guarded by the Home Guard. This is John Grant's garage. So this is the taxi driver agent guy that I was talking about. And there's the dummy camp, just outside Boter Garden. So about there is where the community hall is now. And Eddie Shaw, who I was talking to a few weeks ago, says it did actually end up with wooden huts built on it. So they were quite serious about what they were doing. And they even had sort of Royal Engineers turn up from time to time, appearing to do maintenance work. All sorts of dodges. But again, Home Guard having to play the part and pretend to be part of that unit. There's a wee story I'll share with you about Colin Gubbins. Colin Gubbins had an extensive career, shall we say, before he disappeared off to the west coast to Aknagari to set up the commandos. And he'd done that, and I think this is a story that kind of tells you what security situations were like. He'd done all the donkey work, requisitioned the castle, set it all up, and then began to worry about whether the security was tight enough. So he got hold of one of the head gamekeepers, and he asked him, he said, well, what do you think? He said, do you think we're all right? Do you think local people will keep quiet? And this guy looked at him for a few seconds in silence and sort of probably took his deerstalker off, and he said, and excuse my cod West Isles accent, but he said, well, he said, 200 years ago, he said, we never told on the prince, so I think you're going to be all right. and that's the kind of atmosphere and cooperation that seemed to have permeated the whole kind of thing. If you want to know more about Colin Gubbins, come next week. I mean, strangers would have stood out like a sore thumb, as we've said. So I hope you're not of nervous disposition, ladies, because I had to put this in. 26th of June 1940, not only did the Home Guard find itself having to deal with all the military stuff, with the police constable at the station, and I based this around Boat because it happens to be where most of the information has been found. They also had to deal with holidaymakers who were determined that because the station hotel had reopened, they were damn well going to have their holiday. And off the train came a Professor Herring from John Radcliffe Hospital in Oxford, and Lady Strathy Kyle of Lochhalch, and Lady Morissette from London in Ontario, etc. And the reason they came was partly for the fishing, and partly to get away from London and the south, where invasion looked possible, but also because hotels were not subject to rationing. Their menus were tightly controlled by the army food requisitioning people, but there was no rationing. So if you had the money, you could actually bail out and go to these places and see out the duration of the war, and they became known as funk holes for obvious reasons. However, there were two other this is Jackie the Post, by the way, at Boat. He's actually in the Boat-Garten platoon. Right. Also off that train came these two ladies, and this is where life gets quite interesting. So we'll deal with this lady first. Here she is. Have I got her name up? Yes, this is Mrs. de Villiers, Bertha Antoine May. No, sorry, that's the wrong one. Hang on, where is she? Have I put her name on there? No. Oh, there we go. Marie Chilvers. Marie Chilvers was employed by the SOE to ply agent candidates with drink, either up in the stations where there was a decent bar or at the various hotels. And one of their favourite locations was the station hotel in Boat-Garten. And the idea was that she would get them to spill the beans about who they were and what they were doing. And she did succeed with one gentleman. and his companions got fed up with him and threw him in the spade. I'll give you more of it if you come to the hotel, to the museum. There's more about that next week. But the other lady, Dorothy Gabitas, and I'm sorry about this slightly risque photograph, but there she is, of all places, here in room 501 in the Admiralty. And she was another of the agents Fifi that were employed. So this lady is Agent Fifi and this lady is Agent Jane. And if you're aware of the World War II cartoons about Jane, slightly risque young lady who got into all sorts of scrapes and regularly seemed to lose a lot of her clothing, if not all of it. This girl, my mother described as a bit of a goer. Now, my mother was born in 1923. This lady was her aunt. So this lady is actually my great aunt by marriage. After the war, she ended up breeding Irish red setters and showing them at Crufts. But more of that later. A bit of more information here about the munitions dump. This, by the way, is the German map. That's what happens if the RAOC get it wrong, as they did at Soham in 1940, and that's an explosion of just one wagon. The engine driver and fireman of the train won the George Cross because of the blackout. The engine open cab was covered with tarpaulin, so they actually couldn't see very well, and didn't realise that the brakes had been left on one of the wagons, and the friction set the wagon on fire. So what they did is they stopped the train, ran back and uncoupled the rear of the train behind the burning wagon, drew the wagon away, then stopped again and uncoupled the burning wagon and drew away, leaving it isolated. So that's the result of, I can't remember how many bombs going off, 2,500 pound bombs, and it destroyed the station and the heart of the village. So I'm not sure Botergarten knew quite what they were in for, had there been a problem. Probably just as well. Those are the huts again. There's an RAOC officer with his high-tech system of laying out how a depot should look. Just lumps of whatever laid out on the ground. And we don't have any photographs of what Abernethy would have looked like, but it would have been something like that. And that's why there are no visible remains up there anymore, because that's all there was. And what was left over they threw in Lochgarten or set fire to.
Steve?
Yeah.
One of the Quonset huts.
Sorry?
One of the Quonset huts which were at Grotnagarn.
Yes.
I and others took apart.
All right.
And used it to put up for the original covers for Highland Drovers, which was up on Kincardine. For those of you who know the back road on the B970, you might have seen the sign back in the day called for Highland Drovers. I remember taking the darn thing down. It wasn't easy.
Interesting. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for that. That's yeah, they were rapidly replaced by elephant huts and concert huts, which were a lot bigger, I think. But anyway. This place is fascinating. I'm going to do a bit of speculation now. There were two fires in this depot, one in 43, and the RASC guys who were stationed here were called out to the cinema to go and help deal with it. And that's when they threw a lot of the stuff into Lochgarten. And the RAOC were not very pleased because they had to fish it all out again because it was still serviceable. But in 1945 there was another big fire up there, and they did actually set fire to the forest. And the question is, what were they burning? Now, I've asked this question of logistics, museums, and finally ended up putting a suggestion to the Royal Engineers down at Chatham, and their reply back was, well, we're not saying that isn't what happened, and we're not saying that is what happened. I mentioned the Lysander Squadron up at RAF Longman. That Lysander Squadron was also equipped to drop mustard gas bombs and spray mustard gas had there been a German invasion into the Murray Firth. And actually, as far as this area is concerned, that was the biggest possibility, that a mountain-trained battalion would cross from Norway and chop that line of communication. You have to remember that virtually all North Sea coastal traffic by shipping had stopped because of the problems of being bombed and shot at by the Luftwaffe out of Norway and North Germany and Denmark. The line, the coastal line, had virtually shut down. There were no trains, or very few trains at all, running along the coastal line. We managed to get the timetables out of National Archives in London and had a look. So the communications up Wick, Thurso and on to Scupper Flow, of course, and indeed the Royal Navy depots at Invergordon were vital, and the Home Guard became very, very heavily involved in making sure that that threat could be met, but also the guys who were doing the planning of such things got permission to stockpile mustard gas bombs and mustard gas liquid. When you can't move that stuff because it's too volatile or unstable, you set fire to it. You don't ship it or try and get it back to anywhere, you set fire to it. I'm suggesting fairly strongly that the reason that there are no records at all about what happened in Abernethy that have survived or have been released is because it probably stored some fairly nasty stuff and it was kept quiet. But it's a good story. I think it's Bill who said never let history get in the way of a good story. But anyway, that's my view at the moment. It would be nice to be proved wrong or right. And there is a picture. There's the grid thing that we showed you. There is the vehicle park for the RAOC Central Munition. You see, and this is where there was a Canadian sawmill here. So you can imagine the Home Guard guarding these bridges and roads to stop people getting where they shouldn't was a vital activity. So how likely was invasion? Well, as it turns out, I'm not going to bang on too much about it. If you're interested, you need to read McCluskey's book, that's published as long ago as 1988. This is a crucial thing. I was had the privilege of seeing this war game scenario at Sandhurst take place back in 1974. And the general historic opinion now is that had the Germans attempted to invade across the Channel in 1940, it would have been an absolute disaster for them. So perhaps the war would have been shorter if they'd tried. I don't know. The Home Guard consisted of over 1.25 highly trained and equipped men. The British Army consisted of 750,000 highly trained and well-equipped men in 21 divisions or more. And don't forget, 21 divisions is 9 battalions or regiments of infantry, armour, artillery, support services. Replenishment and retraining of guys had gone on so quickly. But also that Hitler had no plans to invade in 1940 until September. There was absolutely no planning whatsoever. And the only way they were going to do it was to requisition Dutch barges and tow across behind tugs. To protect that force, the Germans had 12 destroyers, the Royal Navy had 70. And that scenario did not include the 70 Royal Naval destroyers in the reenactment of that war game. So that situation is probably an underestimate. So actually, as it turned out, the invasion was highly unlikely and downright improbable. It kind of goes against the general tenor of what we're always told was happening through June and July and so on, August. You know, it was all terrible. But without being rude about Winston Churchill, I think the dire message that he put out and the you know, we'll fight them on the beaches business suited him politically. And I think recent events have demonstrated that politicians are capable of saying what suits them. Perhaps I shouldn't have said that. Nevertheless, defences were built at Culben. And this is the Culben Sands area. I don't get visited it at all and walked along there. There's still quite a lot there. And that's where the 3rd Infantry Division at Montgomery's was practising D-Day. Incidentally, in April 1940, he had a holiday in Strathspey, salmon fishing along the Grant and Castle beat. And there are photographs of him. They parked his armoured train up at Dalwhinnie, and he got in his Rolls Royce and swanned around up and down here, salmon fishing before D-Day. I wonder if that was a deliberate part of deception, actually, that one of the main commanders was going on holiday, so it's highly unlikely anything was going to happen. But anyway, I don't know. Training. The Home Guard were not inept. They were highly trained, well equipped, and in exercises against regular troops, very often, if not invariably, came out on top because they were manoeuvring and carrying out exercises on their home ground. And most of them were farmers and gamekeepers who knew exactly what to do and where to go and how to go around about it. They were actually a formidable force of people, would be my assessment. And they had a battle school at this place here. So the officers were sent to these two places to be trained, and this is where their Murrayshire and Inverness-shire Home Guard had a battle school where they practiced all their tactics. And what they formed amongst the fitter and, it has to be said, somewhat younger members were mobile battle groups that could be deployed and shunted wherever. And again, through the various deception and wireless systems that the British were employing, they made jolly sure that the Germans knew about it. Just as they made sure that they knew that in invasion mustard gas would be used, and in invasion the pipeline booby traps off invasion beaches would be flooded with petrol and set on fire. And that's reminded me of another myth. The only reason there was ever petrol rationing in Britain during the Second World War was to stop civilian movement. There was tons of the stuff in underground stores, an absolute plethora of fuel. There was never a shortage. Just didn't suit authority to have people driving around all over the place. Oh, and you could also do proficiency tests in shooting and stuff. And the guys, who passed it, could qualify for a proficiency badge. So in summary, was it all worth it? You know, if there was never going to be invasion, why did they bother to have all this stuff? Well, the popular move to have a home defence force was unstoppable. So I guess the War Office eventually had to give in. The Home Guard then almost sort of took care of its own destiny by insisting that it guarded and manoeuvred and trained to local purpose. And the mobile battle groups that we just talked about are a case in point. 16-year-olds, 17-year-olds who were allowed or found their way into the Home Guard, and we know some were even younger than that, went into conscription highly trained soldiers already, which improved the quality of the British Army immensely. And some of them went on to have quite interesting careers through the war. And I'll give you one case in point, which is rather personal to me. My father started out in the Home Guard between 1940 and 1942 in Hertfordshire. He then became a Royal Engineers bomb disposal man, but was seconded to the Special Operations Executive as an instructor and served with the Ling up in Abernethy for a short while. He was sent abroad to Burma, where he served on both Chindit's expeditions, served with the SAS behind enemy lines in France in 1944, went back to Burma in 1945, where he was found removing Japanese booby traps from the Rangoon temple complex, and then in 46 and 47 was sent to Belfast for 2 years to deal with IRA bombs. And that all came about, that whole expertise and career came about because he'd served in the Home Guard and acquired expertise and knowledge. And he's not the only one. There's plenty of examples of guys like that who had their first experience with the Home Guard and went on to do quite remarkable things. Going to finish with a plea. If you know of anybody who used to serve with the Home Guard locally, can you please let us know? I haven't done it, but I feel like writing to Army Records in Glasgow and asking them for a definitive list of Home Guardsmen. And I know what the answer will be: on your bike, son. Because you can only apply for one guy at a time, and you've got to know their name before you do. And you've got to be the only surviving relative as well, or eldest surviving relative. Otherwise you'd get charged 30 quid for the privilege. But anyway, what I'm saying is a definitive list of Home Guardsmen never ever existed. He was never ever kept. And those that have survived have only done so by accident. And from what I've said about the Home Guard, I hope you will agree with me that I think that is a bit of a disgrace. They deserve better than that. They deserve a better acknowledgement of their service and their expertise than that. If you compare our situation with the Canadian Forestry Corps, for example, who formed the 3rd Inverness Battalion, Home Guard Canada, if you go on their website, they had a rolling number of around 750 Canadian Home Guard serving with the 3rd Inverness. You go on their website, they've got 815 names identified as to exactly who they were, what rank they held, where they were from, what they went on to do, did they die over here, did they join the Canadian Regulars, and wherever. We haven't got that, and it is such a shame. So with that, thank you very much.
Such a massive story. The scale of it all is just so enormous. I wonder if we've got a minute or two for any sort of general questions, because inevitably there's a lot of questions and discussion informally once we've sort of
Absolutely.
wound things up. But if there's any general points, comments, bits of information just at the moment, then
Feel free.
That's a silly one. Who looked after the whiskey?
Who looked after it? You should have been at the museum last week.
No, sorry.
Right. The distilleries were shut down, except that nationally Scotland was allowed to produce 21 tonnes of whisky a year. But having said that, it was the whisky production that was shut. The raw spirit was a highly valuable material. It was used in the production of fuel, paint thinner and all the rest of it, for the manufacture of perspex for aircraft canopies. It was used in the production of morphine for medicinal purposes. It was used as a disinfectant. So Balmenic and all the rest would have continued to produce raw spirit, but it was shipped away for other purposes. Yeah, yeah, good one.
One or two little observations. My father was a local bus driver during the war. There were two bus drivers, early shift and late shift. And when they were off duty, they were the ambulance driver.
Oh, so
And
would they have
so-
been with the field?
Yeah. So, but, I mean, talking about training and so on, he got all sorts of first aid training and was really quite well equipped, you know. But
Absolutely.
nobody knew about it. Nobody knows about it now.
No, no.
One of the other things is about aircraft landing. I don't know how well you know the golf course at Grantham, but the second hole is quite a long, flat hole. And during the war, it was bristling with strainer posts,
Right,
about 6 or 8 feet high,
yeah,
in case of a landing, because that was the only place, probably in the area that an aircraft could land.
I think they did the same at Colburn. They stuck poles into the sand
right,
area
yeah.
there for the same reason.
Yeah.
What I didn't know is that the British and Americans, particularly in Burma, developed a method whereby the Horsa glider would land and disgorge its guys, and if it was still in a fit state to be reused, they actually developed a method by which an aircraft could fly over trailing a wire and a hook, hook it on and tow it off again. I've never ever heard of that before, but yeah, quite remarkable. I'm just looking because somewhere in here I have a list of the field ambulance group.
Ambulance,
We've got a photograph of that somewhere, I'm sure.
all right.
But, and there are some names that go with it.
Uh-huh.
But as always, when you're looking for something, you can't jolly well find it.
With regard to rifles and shotguns, all the gamies were supplied with cartridges. Now, they weren't the standard cartridge, which has something like 80 or 90 tiny little balls. They had one single ball, just one little lump of lead,
Right.
and that could kill at 100 yards, whereas the shotgun was only efficient to
Yeah.
40, 50 yards.
I've found this list of names. There's R. Cameron, James Dewar, Ron Armstrong,
James Dewar, yeah, he was the local banker.
somebody Ross,
No.
Bill Thane,
Yeah, Bill Thane was.
Bill
yeah.
Hare,
Bill Thane was the Prudential Insurance Agent one
Right.
after
F. Cruikshank,
yes,
R.G. Mann, somebody Robertson, W. Shaw,
means, that means, wheel and pipers,
right? Somebody Buttress,
yes.
Isa
Johnny
Moyes,
Buttress, he made kilts.
right? Isa Moyes, Lionel
Boyd, yeah,
McMillan.
Boyd had the local cycle shop.
Right.
It's really something about Boyd. He had a small shack for a garage. He sold cycles. He had a small shack as a garage down in Forest Road. And eventually he graduated and bought, which is the butcher shop now.
Right.
And he's had this all done up.
Yeah.
And when you're doing up a place, you whitewash the window. And a pal of mine who's a bit of a wag, he got a job there. And he wrote on the inside, on the window, Fred Boyd was the fellow's name. And he wrote on the inside on this whitewash, in Grantown it's Boyd's, in London it's Lloyd's.
Very nice. And a Lionel McMillan, T.C. Gordon, James Mitchell, and there are 4 others that we don't know, but perhaps you have to get together with Bill and look at the photograph and identify them.
I remember seeing on eBay up there a sort of leaflet that indicated that George Anderson, who had a hardware shop roughly where Scotland is now and was a cinema proprietor at one time, that he was some sort of local leader, you know,
Right.
in this area
Yeah.
too, you know, use the figurehead.
Yeah. We've got a story in Boat, a guy called Chalmers, James Chalmers. I think he must have been one of the officers, but he was supposed to be, it must have been quite early on because it was a Lee Enfield that he was messing around with. I don't know if you've ever shot one at all, anybody here, but they do, as good a rifle as they are, they have a fault in that they're what they call cock on lock, excuse me for such language, but basically what happens is that you bolt across, forward, lock, and that is supposed to engage the firing mechanism with the trigger. And if you aren't fairly vigorous slamming the bolt home, and I've had this happen to me, the firing pin engages but the trigger mechanism doesn't. And this is what happened to him. So obviously aimed where he was supposed to be aiming and it didn't go off. So touched it, bang, off it goes, sorry. And you touch the bolt and it suddenly whips through and fires there. The bullet went right over the top of the village and through the doors of the GNS railway engine loco shed and hit the back wall and frightened the life out of the guys who were working there. But yeah.
There you go. Thank you very much. And that, sorry?
You were talking about the anti-aircraft at fires.
Yes.
Presumably they were protecting the power station.
Yes, that's
Because
right.
there was an attempt, I seem to recall, being told by someone on why that there was one attempt to bomb it. Because there was this story of this gentleman who watched as a young man, this single German bomber come up Loch Ness, turn left as it were, and fly up and over. I don't think the bomb actually hit, but
No.
caused slight consternation in fires.
I think there was an expectation that there'd be a lot more aerial activity through this area than there actually was. I mean, the Germans had superb aerial reconnaissance camera kit. And they had it would be a Junkers, whatever.
Or a Condor.
It was a pressurised aircraft supplied with oxygen and it could fly at about 45,000, 50,000 feet.
Was that not a Condor?
No, it was a
Which was a long range one.
Junkers 86P, I think. Anyway, whatever.
Yes, sorry.
And with those cameras, they could have taken a lot of aerial photography, but they simply didn't do it enough. So aerial photography only really works when you can compare changes, which I think is why the munitions dump track was never tarmacked, because that would have been an immediate signal that there was something worth bothering with up the track. But anyway, sorry, Don.
No, I was going to say, it's always a measure of success that there's thoughts and ideas and memories and stories generated from a presentation.
Well, you have to-
and obviously, that's
This gentleman
just
stuff written
done.
down.
So thank you very much indeed for that story of the massiveness of it, the mysteries and the myths, and so much in there, so many stories with it. So for that, thank you very much indeed.
That's a
We are
pleasure.
much indebted.
And if you want to know more, we're doing the Norwegian accounts of the Ling next
Thursday,
Thursday.
7
Is that right,
o'clock.
Bill? At the museum.
27th of October, 7 o'clock
Yeah.
in the museum. And if anyone's good on Norwegian, I happen to be sitting with several Norwegian accounts, including the most recent book, because there's a wee group of the Norwegians across just recently, and I had the privilege of taking them around some of the sites. So that's 27th of October. 28th of October, the museum's got their wildlife artists in residence right through to the 6th of November, and changing theme altogether, next weekend, the wonderful bookmark crime festival, Death in Grantown, Dark Nights and Dark Days, takes place in Rhoda, and it's full of wondrous things with a wonderful range of authors. Marjorie has done incredibly well getting all of those. And our own programme next month, which will be the 18th of November, we're picking up the theme of Sandy Leddingham's pictures, and Peter Moore is coming to talk on some of the background to that. Moving on to January, we're virtually going out to Ballintom, which is a fascinating site. It's probably the richest site of all around Strathspey. And in February, 16th of February, we have this most wonderful piece of research, which we're dying to hear about, the story of football in Grantown that Rob's been working on, and it's so gratifying that someone has done local research in that depth, and we're looking forward very much to hearing about that. And just to finish off the year, we're back with a military theme, and we're exploring the war graves of Strathspey with the War Graves Commission. And if there's anything else.
Last month's talks on the website.
Sorry?
Last month's talk on the society website.
Thank you very much. Yes, for those who couldn't make it last month, the video of the presentation, the industrial one, is on our website.
And of course, the museum is, well, Frank Bargett's doing on the museum on the
Thank you.
13th of December.
Thank you. Yes.
His presentation on the work he's done, and the book he's written, I might add. The presentation, if I remember rightly, is called The Neglected Parish of Kincardine, which covers the Kincardine-Tulloch area.
Yes, thank you for that. Yes, another one that's well worth going to. So, thank you all very much indeed for coming, and wonderful audience. Thank you very much indeed for that, and we shall see you all in the fullness of time again, one way or another. Anyone who hasn't got membership of this organisation, now's your opportunity to sign up. And anyone who wants to volunteer to help, very welcome. And finally, thanks to the caller who set all this magic stuff up. It's really overwhelming. Thank you very much indeed.